welcome to the Zero Input Agriculture Podcast. Today I have I know I say this every time, and I know I'm saying it right now, but a really interesting guest who is not only an experimental farmer, but has some really interesting perspectives on uh, cultural worldview outlooks, and the potential benefits we can find in tapping into older, um, I guess you call them religious cultures, but I mean, they're kind of pre-religious in terms of
Yeah, yeah,
shamanism and animism. So, anyway, Capello, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you ended up on this path in life?
yeah. I got into working with sustainable and regenerative agriculture through I guess you could call it the permaculture movement, the permaculture philosophy. I took, a bunch of their certification courses way back in the day. Very inspiring for me personally. Worked on a few kind of experimental farms using permaculture techniques. And this was like in the early 2000s, very concerned about peak oil and energy issues around the same time. Decided that it might be, I was living in the Northeast at the time, decided it might be wise to relocate
Hmm.
and um, relocated to Appalachia, Southern Appalachia, in the late 20, 20 aughts, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
And started actually trying to put some of those ideas into practice, mostly around perennial tree crops, hazelnuts in particular, trying to go after a silvopastoral, approach using integrating sheep into, sheep and nut crops, trying to get those to play well together. Um, the area of Appalachia that I'm in focuses on cattle and on Christmas trees, which is not only a not a low input crop, but is also not a crop that feeds people or nourishes people, or it's a very
Mm.
vulnerable sort of it's so I was looking at this region and thinking, okay, what is a high value crop that might work here? So that's sort of the thought behind hazelnuts and tree crops.
Mm.
And all this was years ago, and we can talk more about how the hazelnuts have done and other things we've experimented with. But as time went on, um, I became interested in archaeology of all things, which kind of led me to this realization that, and it kind of like echoes back to my days of learning about permaculture, is that there are different ways of thinking about the land. I was originally, even though I was involved in permaculture, I was very skeptical about the lack of scientific rigor for some of its claims, and was always looking for more. And thankfully, there is more of it now. It's really come a long way,
Mm.
I think. But then I started realizing that there are different ways of relating to the land, and there's ways you can learn about your land that um, kind of almost require a different mentality. And I started sort of appreciating a little bit more about the role of patterns, for example, the role of patterns in permaculture, stuff that I sort of glossed over and thought was interesting when I was learning about it the first time. But then I started thinking, like, wow, if you don't actually have access to high quality scientific research all the time about questions that you're interested in, learning to actually see patterns and live within the interconnectedness of patterns is really important for the kind of implicit learning that's needed to actually connect to your land. So that's kind of what I've been interested in a little bit more lately. And it does sort of give a little bit of a different perspective on like human prehistory and religion and philosophy and all this interesting stuff. But I'll stop there for now because that
Yeah,
kind of
we'll
gives
save
you,
that for the end. We'll save
yeah,
that for the end. People
yeah, yeah.
people have to people have to hang out. I'm hanging out to talk about that too. But let's talk about particular crops, or in your case, livestock that you work with. We don't often get to talk to people who do much work with animals as well, and integrating the
Yeah.
two. That's a really fascinating puzzle that I'm also working with. So tell me a bit about your hazelnuts and your sheep and any other species that are kind of in that silver pasture system.
Yeah, so it's mostly chickens, sheep. And I would say neither experiment has gone well. So if you want like If you want like a good background on like maybe what not to try or what to be aware of if you're thinking of trying this,
Mm.
here are some, sort of almost cautionary sort of things about sheep and orchard crops. So we were interested in hazelnuts because of their um, protein content, the rapid growth rate that they have, their yield potential, their market potential. Kind of going back to the collapse question, it's sort of like, okay, if the future of our civilization and our food systems is in doubt, we don't know what the future is going to look like. We wanted something that could be marketable if markets are still a thing.
Hmm.
Um, but we also wanted something that could nourish local people, including ourselves, our own family on a homestead, um, if global markets are not a thing. And, what a timely topic. um,
And it was a
so,
staple crop in like Neolithic Europe. I think
yes, it
excavations, it
was.
was
And
like half of the diet in some places.
yeah, so where they do well, that humans will go for the protein and the humans will go for the fat. And hazelnuts really have both. Now, there's some challenges to growing hazelnuts in the eastern United States because they are susceptible to a fungal pathogen called Eastern filbert blight,
Mm.
which is why they were not developed here. In all other respects, the climate here is, in terms of rainfall and a lot of other factors, is pretty comfortable for them.
Hmm.
But we have a native hazelnut actually, we have two different species of native hazelnut in the eastern United States, which carry this disease. And the disease is, the natives are resistant to it. The European hazelnuts, which are kind of the more high yielding ones, are not, at least
Mm.
until recently. So we kind of came into this just at the same time that the University of Oregon, Rutgers University, and a few others, I think Kansas State possibly, um, were doing breeding programs, including um, germplasm from Asian varieties of native, hazelnuts in Kazakhstan and other countries like that, trying to improve the disease resistance profiles
Mm.
of European hazelnuts. So
It's a bit like
we kind
chestnut
of
blight in reverse, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's a really good. I've never thought of putting it that way before, but yeah, that's basically exactly what it is. So
Mm.
we have something that we would like to grow here that doesn't grow here, that is, gets ransacked by these native pathogens.
Mm.
And so on that front, using those varieties for our area, that part has been mostly successful.
Mm.
So those resistance genes have really come through pretty good. Even the ones that were not really supposed to work out here. There's some Italian varieties that have a little bit of resistance.
Hmm.
Some of those have died back on we have two different plots here, two different test plots for hazelnuts. And even those Italian varieties, some of them have actually come through. But then there's a bunch of other problems related to stink bugs. So that's a whole different, the brown marmorated stink bug. Um, that's a whole different, then the different biocontrols for that, we can get into that later. But
Mm.
um, going back to the livestock, so the idea is for grass competition, grass control, the sheep are essentially living lawnmowers. They don't really serve any other function other than maybe, a little bit of fertility coming in, although they also compact the soil, which is something to be a little concerned about.
Mm.
Um, we learned early on that they will also strip the bark from hazelnut trees,
Hmm.
which is really not good. So we had to transition to a system of using what do you call it? Rotational grazing, using electronet, and moving sheep through narrow electronet runs
Mm.
between hazelnut rows, which
Tricky.
is tricky, but it worked. I mean, we
Hmm.
had an entire generation of sheep here that lived in those little runs, and they didn't seem, once they got used to it, they didn't seem bothered by it at all.
Now, I'm guessing with
Um,
sheep, you've got an advantage. They like eating low down, whereas doing this with goats would have been much trickier because they won't generally eat very close to the ground if they can avoid it.
yes, that's one of the reasons we went with sheep, although not They will eat bark and they will eat leaves.
Mm,
Now, the sheep that we went with for ease of management and also for disease resistance were Katahdin sheep, hair sheep. So
mm,
these are sheep that you don't need to shear. They have better disease resistance profiles. They're very tough. They can survive in really harsh climates without any kind of shelter. Um, but they also act a little bit more like goats.
hmm.
So I've talked to apple, orchard keepers who have integrated sheep into their pastures, and they say they don't have any problems really with sheep damaging their trees, but they are using wool sheep. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of thinking now that if I had to do this all over again, I might have picked a somewhat more domesticated breed of sheep.
One thing I've heard, I think this was a vineyard in New Zealand that was using sheep to manage weed pressure. They found that when they supplemented the sheep with large amounts of minerals like seaweed or rock dust, that they stopped stripping the bark off the
Yeah.
trees because often that's what they're going after the bark for. There's higher mineral levels in that particular tissue.
I There was one point where I really hoped that would be the case. We got, salt blocks and, different feed supplements and
Mm,
things to sort of see if that could, maybe it was a nutrient deficiency, but
not in this
it,
case.
no, they just like the way it tastes. I
Yeah.
mean, to a sheep, I guess, especially in springtime, that's when the damage happens
Yeah.
kind of the most to a sheep in springtime before there's a huge amount of grass, there's sap running through
Hmm.
these trees and it's got sugar in it. And it's just like, it must be like a lollipop or something for
And
them.
it's easy to
So,
reach.
yeah,
In really mature stands of hazels, could that impact be useful? I'd imagine like in early establishing stands, it could be disastrous, but once the hazels have kind of really filled out, given the way that they grow from a crown and resprout, is there any
yeah,
particular potential use of that impact?
I've thought about that. So, we were initially, for ease of harvesting, going for because you can prune and train hazels to whatever kind of growth pattern you want. So
Mm,
we were, and a lot of the commercial producers train them to be single trunk trees,
mm,
um, which is not how they natively, prefer to grow. They are a shrub that suckers. Most of them will sucker a lot, so they'll make these kind of stands of um, multiple stems.
mm,
Um, and it turns out that for a lot of other reasons, growing them the way they want to grow is probably, of course, with the permaculture background, I probably should have seen this coming way before I did. But like the way they want to grow is how they are healthiest. So
mm,
when it comes to disease pressure, especially, having multiple trunks means that if one is getting old, if it's getting a little blighted, you can take it out. In fact, hazels will self prune to an
mm,
extent where they will tell the tree will tell you, I don't want this. This limb is not working for us anymore. You need to take it out. Um, and there is a potential that maybe livestock could actually sort of help with that process a little bit. We haven't been quite so brave as to actually try it to
mm.
open up. We only have one sheep left, so
Oh yeah.
our sheep have aged out. But if I were to do it over again, is there some way that like the sheep could help us self prune, help with the self pruning? Um, and also, we're seeing problems with productivity now that the hazels are basically mature,
Mm,
where maybe some pressure on them and actually opening up some light gaps in the orchard and having almost like a sustainable kind of self-succession process where, parts of the orchard die back and allow light to come through and grass and other companion plants to come through in a sort of regenerative cycle might actually be the best for production as well.
mm.
So it is something we're thinking about.
Could it tie in with selection? I'm guessing you've got fairly diverse genetics, so you're looking which percentage of your trees are the ones that are performing the best.
Yeah, we have a lot of variety here. I would say maybe 20 or 30 different um, types, and they're making new ones all the time using this new sort of genetic research.
Mm,
Um, And it's kind of a tough balance because they're self-infertile, so
Hmm.
need them to you need different varieties to cross-pollinate, and often the pollen producers are not the best nut producers.
Yep, yep, yep. You can't just
Um,
cut out all of the low producing trees and then suddenly you find there's no pollen left.
right, right. Although they're wind pollinated, which is, for other reasons, that's a great advantage.
Hmm.
With bees in our area have been, and native pollinators have had a lot of trouble out here. Um, so thankfully, we're not quite so vulnerable to that.
Hmm.
But yeah, there's a lot of different issues to sort of navigate with it.
Have you seen anyone use geese during the establishment phase of these kind of orchards?
Yes. I think I know one or two other farmers in my area that have tried to do that. And that was one of our first um, hopes that we could do that as well. And we really looked at like other farms that have tried to do that. But every time we did the math on what it would take for it to work,
Yeah.
we were like, oh, there's no way. But, you know, they are vegetarians. I think if you have a good water source, if you know how to handle the water problem
Hmm.
and the predator problem, it would be something to look at. And in some ways, it would be a lot easier than sheep.
In my experience, they will strip bark, but only when like all of the other weedy vegetation that they could potentially impact is running short.
Yeah.
And the breeds vary a lot too. Like I know in the US you've got tiny remnant population of the cotton weeder geese that were like specifically bred for that particular crop integration.
Mm.
So you might need to embark on a similar program to breed hazel weeder geese. I
Hazel
imagine,
weeder geese. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, somebody has to do it.
Well, and the other thing about geese, and it depends on what your sort of homestead, philosophy is, but geese are a lot easier to eat in
Hmm.
in terms of processing yourself. If you're looking for, to get a source of protein out of your animals, we've never eaten our sheep or
Hmm.
we've never bred them. It's just, we have trouble enough with eating our own chickens. It's just not the amount of effort that goes into it.
Yeah.
It's just a lot. But if you had to choose between, butchering a goose versus a sheep, it's just the barrier to actually using it as a protein source is
Yeah.
much lower
Yeah, processing a sheep takes pretty much a whole day for one person, and a goose you can do in an hour if you know what you're doing.
if you know what you're doing.
Yeah. I really love geese as well too because it's easier to fine tune the size of the flock. Like if you have a drought and the grass stops growing as quickly, you can cull down to a smaller number of breeding animals, and then when the rain returns, they can breed up again really quickly. And but
Mm.
larger animals, it's trickier to make those adjustments. I mean, I guess you can sell heads of animals and then buy them back in again, but then you're relying on being able to transport them around.
And you have to feed them over winter, which is a cost in a temperate climate, which,
Yeah.
which we are. So it's
Mm.
yeah, it's pretty complicated.
Mm. Mm. So what successes did you find with hazels, particularly these newer blight resistant varieties?
Definitely just the if you want to talk about low inputs, like being able to reach maturity and to be healthy trees with really no inputs at all. We maybe limed some of them at planting,
Mm.
maybe did a little bit of a few other soil amendments during planting, but really almost nothing since then. This year is actually the first year that I've really aggressively pruned and limed a section of that orchard to try to hope to get it into production. It's a little unclear right now what our if our production problems are kind of tree nutrient based or if they're insect problems.
Mm.
So yeah, I would say that hazels want to grow. They're very vigorous, healthy, adaptable trees, and it really doesn't take much to get them to grow in pretty poor soils.
Mm. Are you at the stage of applying selection to your plantings? Like, are you starting to cull individuals to kind of improve the average performance?
Yeah, although it's a little unclear sometimes what's going on. Like there are ones that we have culled that were not succeeding, but it's not always clear if it's the variety that's the problem
Hmm.
or if it's the place that they're being planted. So, and this is sort of one of the things I appreciate about your work that I've looked at is really paying very close attention to like micro localized conditions as factors in plant success. So
Hmm.
um, I've seen spots that just don't seem to want to grow anything.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's sort of like it doesn't really matter how many times I put a different variety of this type of tree there. It's like the land is telling me a hazelnut tree doesn't want to grow in this particular place.
Yeah.
Is it a fungal issue? Is there something in the soil? We're on hilly land with a lot of rainfall, so there's like these almost these small areas that are very like permanently wet
Mm.
for large parts of the year. They're not exactly seeps, but they're sort of so it's like, okay, is it wet feet? So it's a little hard to tell um, what is a location issue and what is a selection issue. Although there all are varieties where it's sort of like, okay, these are wimpy trees.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
there's some of the
There's no
pollinators.
pleasing them.
Yeah, it's sort of like you might need them for pollen, but it's sort of like, man, if I could have anything where I don't have to rely on this variety, I would pick something else.
With long-lived perennial like tree crops, um, it's a very complicated dance to like figure out a good tree from a bad tree because particularly like there's a lot of emphasis on precociousness. Like people want to put their orchard in and start getting yield as fast as possible. But I wonder if that's necessarily the only like you could overemphasize that trait and miss out on
Mm,
a lot of amazing trees that they're just going to take a few more years and then they're going to be solid for much longer.
yeah, I've definitely noticed. And also, people look at production the same way. So you might have something that has a better nut quality or a higher yield in theory, but it's going to be a wimpy tree or it's not going to sucker as well. So I've
Mm,
noticed that if you're growing hazelnuts as a shrub, suckering quality is really important to the sustainability of that particular variety.
mm,
There's a very old cultivar of hazelnut called Santium. Santium was one of the first blight resistant varieties, and it has little hard nuts. They don't taste the best. Its yields are kind of mediocre, but man, that variety will sucker like nobody's business. And
mm,
it's sort of like looking at those qualities and be like, if I'm thinking about my land less in terms of a business that I can get off the ground in 5 to 10 years, and more like what does this land have in terms of a genetic potential to generate fat and protein from few inputs
mm,
in a sustainable, like multi-generational model, then suckering ability is kind of pretty high up there in terms of your ability to propagate and to cull damaged trees. So yeah, there's all these factors that when you're looking at a tree catalog, you don't think about.
And I think a lot of the traits that you're looking for, there's a trade-off in biology. Like if you simultaneously want trees to be tall and short at the same time, you're going to not be very happy at the end of the day. Like one of those extremes is going to have to win. And I think there's similar issues with like precocious plants often put so much energy into, churning out nuts as quick as possible. They don't necessarily invest in building up a frame or in pest and disease resistant factors.
Right.
And I mean that happens with flavor as well too. Sometimes the things that make the food taste not like candy are elements that allow it to fend off pests and diseases.
Absolutely. Yeah. That bitterness, I mean, the tannins, like oaks, oaks and acorns, they learned this, they're the champions of this, that like tannins can be your friend.
Mm.
Um, And so, yeah, a lot of the things we're trying to breed out of hazelnuts and other domesticated crops are things that help protect them and make them more successful. A big issue with that that's like kind of like a perfect example is the native varieties of hazelnuts have a husk that kind of so in European hazelnuts there's a leafy kind of husk that encases the nut, but towards maturity it will break away
Mm,
and the nut will actually drop out of that husk and fall on the orchard floor, which is great for harvesting. But if you're facing armies of invasive insects, basically poking and introducing pathogens into your immature nuts,
hmm
having that little protective layer be a little bit thicker and a little more, staying on there a little longer, as much of a nightmare as it is um, to deal with during harvest and processing time, I'm looking at it and thinking, wow, this is kind of like, would we be getting? I visited a farm, last summer, um, that's experimenting with American hazelnuts, and you know, they had some pretty nice yields, and they don't have the disease. I mean, the pest problems that we do.
hmm
Um, and yeah, they have this extra stage of getting the nuts off the husk. I'm thinking, the plants again, going back to permaculture and learning from the patterns in nature, it's sort of like, well, these trees, they're devoting energy to building those husks probably for a good reason.
hmm
Um, so it's sort of our peril to ignore, you know, what the trees are trying to do themselves.
Do you suspect with tree crops, particularly tree staple crops, that traits like biennial bearing could actually be an advantage?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because if you think like a squirrel, right?
Mm,
Which is, an issue for us. We have three different species of squirrel here,
hmm
and they all love hazelnuts. But like, yeah, if you're dealing again, going back to the patterns of nature, trees probably do that for a reason that goes beyond, nutrient availability. We know that, oaks and a lot of other nut-bearing trees go through these mast cycles in order to throw um, animal populations for a loop, essentially, in their breeding
mm,
cycle. So if
hmm
you're a squirrel and you need to breed rapidly, 1 or 2 litters a year, and you're relying on those fat and protein sources, the size of that squirrel population is going to be pretty tightly tied to the nutrients coming off of those trees and what the nut yield is looking like. So
I
if you
love.
introduce some,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
So
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, I love the idea of a culture that has tree crops and annual crops, but they only plant the annual crops at scale when they know the tree crops aren't coming on that year. So like
Oh yeah,
you get periodic bonus years where, oh, we don't have to like, break our backs planting all this corn one year because we can see that the hazels are coming on. So we can, focus on, working on buildings and doing other things for that year.
yeah, that's absolutely true. In fact, this year we are taking essentially a break from our garden, our annual garden, to focus on trees. In fact, my wife is out planting plum trees right now. And my youngest son is out. He's saying, well, if nobody else is using the garden, I'm going to grow a garden this year. So he's sort of taking over a garden space.
Hmm
But yeah, it's a good way of dividing sort of your resources. Um, and also like variability in a polyculture system is what keeps it healthy. Like if you rely on one crop, if you have a drought, if you have a disease come through, if there's trade, there might be trade issues, human produced problems that reduce the success of one particular crop for one season. Having something else to fall back on, our ancestral cultures like understood this intimately that like you need a backup and you need a backup for your backup.
hmm mm. Um, Now, you do pretty much zero input approaches. You mentioned a little bit of liming and other things just during establishment. Maybe we can take a different approach with this and focus on uh, like minimal effort establishment for tree crops. Have you done
Mm.
much experiment? I'm guessing that if you're anything like me, you kind of experiment with gradually reducing how much effort went into each tree, getting it going over time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it would take a completely different, if I were to revisit my orchard with that mentality, um, it would be a completely different approach to, like, if I had to do it all over again, I would do it a completely different way,
Hmm.
which is basically this. And this is, I'm assuming you're familiar with Mark Shepard's work in
Yes, yeah, I've
regenerative.
interviewed
Okay,
him
so
before. He's amazing.
yeah, amazing guy. But like, I remember reading his book for the first time and being like, who the hell has the money to deal with this many failures? Like his entire system is very failure dependent in the sense that you need to be able to throw a ton of stuff in the ground and you have to be willing to see 80% of it die in order for you to get that stuff that is well adapted to that specific location, that specific variety.
Mm,
And I really kind of like saw that and I was like, wow, that's, maybe he can afford to do that. I can't afford to do that. But in hindsight, I was thinking about it, I think, in the wrong way. I think if I were to approach establishing an orchard in a low input way, I would look at it much more from the perspective of a tree breeder, almost like a nursery operation,
hmm
more than I would from the perspective of somebody who's buying plants at retail, investing heavily in each one, really, putting a lot of resources into the success of every individual tree.
mm.
Um, you need to, if you want to do it with fewer inputs that way, I think in establishment, I think really putting your effort into the ability to make new plants,
Yeah.
um, and to see them fail and actually almost like want them to work it out for themselves in the sense that like, okay, we have, an abundance of this type this year. We're just going to throw them in the ground and see what they do. The luxury of being able to do that, I think you can let them sort of figure out success for themselves because in my experience, like if you baby a tree in a place where it doesn't want to grow, it might succeed, it might survive better, it might be the difference between survival and not, but it's still not going to be that abundant and happy. Like
Yeah.
it's sort of like giving them the room to experiment with the land themselves is really important. And to do that, you need to be able to push out a lot of baby trees.
Is it getting easier to find the right diversity and quality and cost of propagating material in the US for tree crops that it's becoming easier for people to take this low input, propagate it yourself, and expect a lot of it to not make it approach? I'm imagining, I know Mark Shepard, when he started, he had to like really pull out all the stops to get that original genetic material that was up to the job. But I think now that there are Mark Shepards around selling their propagating material, it's starting to get easier. Am I right in guessing that?
No, that is correct. There's the varieties that are available now, just, even 15, 20 years ago blows it out of the water. I mean, it's you can get stuff you never even heard about. You might read, what's the guy who wrote the Uncommon Fruits? It's a book on temperate, rare sort of rare temperate tree crops. I'm blanking on the name of the author. He's a pretty famous dude, but
Mm,
you read his book and he's talking about all these different things, and it's like I can't order any of that. Like I can't get my hands on any of that material.
mm,
Now you can. Now you can find stuff you've never heard of before. The permaculture world has really come a long way in this too. Like perennial vegetables. Like there was a whole catalog we were looking at this year of perennial vegetables. Stuff we've sort of heard about through the grapevine over the years, but like getting access to the material was hard. So
and not just like one strain of it, but like diverse strains that maybe if
yes,
you're lucky, someone's already started mixing up and done that hard work.
right. And people who can report on, their success and like where you can see beautiful pictures of what the crop actually looks like.
Mm,
This is information, a level of information that we didn't really have like a decade ago,
mm,
for a lot of things. So it has come a long way. So like we're experimenting with what are they called? Honeysuckle, edible honeysuckle. Oh
Oh, for the
gosh,
berries?
yeah. Hardy to zone two, which I know you're in a warmer climate. You probably don't worry about these things, but
Mm,
honeyberry. So,
mm,
so this is like honeysuckles in a temperate climate. They can be invasive, very tough plants.
mm,
So this is a easy and very easy to propagate.
mm.
Um, so we're putting some of those in the ground between our plums this year. Um, and apple varieties. It's a lot easier to access certain apple varieties now. So yeah, it's really come a long way.
And in your, I'm also interested in your, now that your hazelnut system is more established and the animal pressure isn't needed as much, are there more opportunities for understory crops? Is that something that you're also playing around with? The honeyberry sounds like that's just part of that opportunity.
Yeah, so I think it's better. Personally, I would do that more in an establishment because the hazels are so shady. I mean, we planted them on, I want to say like 15-foot centers. So they are now at the point where their canopies are overlapping. There's not even grass
Mm,
underneath
mm.
big patches of that orchard. So, and those parts of the orchard went from high yielding to low yielding. So I'm sort of wondering if like actually thinning some of that out and making enough sunlight for um, stuff that can grow as an understory um, might be a good idea. Now, does it make sense to put a perennial there? Does it make sense to put an herb there? I'm not sure yet. So thinning those out and sort of creating artificial light gaps to create a potential understory environment is something we're kind of excited about. And I think will improve the health of the trees.
Mm.
This is all stuff if I had, gosh, what is his name? The guy who did all the big stuff on food forests maybe 10 years ago.
Oh,
Um,
what's his name? Elliot? No.
no, man, I met him at several conferences. I feel bad. I
Oh,
should,
I'm thinking of one from the 1800s. It's going further back.
he wrote uh, two different like huge textbooks on how to grow food forests. Anyway,
Mm,
apologies to him for not remembering his name, but he talks about all these different layers in a food forest system,
mm.
which I ignored when I was establishing my orchard because I was like, we want production in 5 years. We want to be able to market hazelnuts and process them, and
And you want
we
to
have
do
to bring
one thing
process.
well first.
Yeah. Well, thinking, as a source of income, and this is really where capitalism kind of like interferes with good orchard planning is like, well, okay, if you want to supplement your income as a family off of a farm, you need to be able to think about it in these sort of calculable terms.
I almost wonder
And
if good genetics, like well selected for local conditions, have a higher potential ROI than just here's a ton of something you can eat.
yeah, I think so. You just need the time to be able to let that story kind of like come alive.
Yeah. And
And we
apply
just
that selection, like to really pay attention to what you're growing.
over like three generations,
Mm,
probably. Like if you
hmm
really wanted to, I would need my like, grandchildren to be looking at my hazelnuts and being like, granddad, he used these varieties, but these are the ones that really want to thrive here.
mm,
But that's just so foreign to how we solve problems
hmm
in this current, social system we have.
I mean, that's one advantage of the hazelnuts is that they're relatively fast compared to other staple tree crops in the temperate zone. I think they're like 5 to 10 years and they can start producing.
Yeah, you'll start getting yields in 5 to 10 years.
Mm,
I mean, they'll be light, but it also depends. I've seen like little tiny ones that if they get enough sun and we had some that we failed to transplant at one point. And so they were growing in a kind of incubator bed that had a lot of like peat moss in it and other, stuff. that was meant to be temporary. And those things started, producing nuts in like the third or fourth year. So if you make the trees happy enough, they will start producing very, very fast.
Mm. Oh, now that's another potential advantage of hazelnuts that you wanted to talk about because your part of the world had a massive storm recently. Did you want to
Yes.
elaborate on all of that?
Yeah, so this is just a little bit of a thing that I didn't really think about too much when I was establishing an orchard, which is, um, for people who aren't aware, Appalachia got hit by Hurricane Helene last fall, which was an absolutely devastating tropical hurricane that happened to go in this weird trajectory off the Gulf that went right through the mountains, and it just really devastated this region, destroyed entire towns. Um,
The flooding was
but it,
off the charts.
yeah, the flooding was bad, the wind was bad, um, flash flooding, mudslides, all of it, which we usually don't get here very much. We get harsh winters here, but we usually don't get hurricanes to that extent. But it was really kind of an eye opener for me because, I'm looking at walnuts, I'm looking at chestnuts, I'm looking at apples, I'm looking at all these different tree crops. A lot of them depend on a relatively intact central trunk. Now, apples are pretty forgiving. They can have a lot of damage to their main trunk, and they will still produce if you take care of them, if you prune them right. I don't know as much about chestnuts or walnuts, what happens to them. I guess walnuts you can um, pollard and they will still produce, but um,
But if it's a staple crop and it takes them another 5 years
right,
to come back and your whole valley gets flattened, that can be devastating to a culture if they're relying on it for food.
exactly. And I never really thought about that before, but now I'm thinking, gosh, if that's a factor, if that's a variable, hazels kind of take on a little bit of a different light because they're multi-stem, shrubs, but they're also, if you've ever seen the kind of wicker type, not wicker, but people used to make garden beds in medieval times. They would make
Yeah,
garden
like
beds,
woven fences.
yeah, because they're extremely flexible. So in terms of wind damage, hazelnuts are essentially invulnerable to wind.
Hmm.
There's really no amount of wind that will actually get a hazelnut that's trained as a shrub to break. And I'm like, okay, that's an advantage I never really thought about before. And there's going to be more of that in terms of like, I'm thinking, well, what is the wildfire resistance of these different tree crops? Because that's something, we will probably have to deal with as well. So,
Mm.
what are the different, in terms of climate change, as things get more severe, are there variables to our crops that we haven't really thought about?
It's one reason I think annuals have been so important in history is their ability to bounce back from disasters. Like you can just have one small pot of seeds that manages to survive, the worst possible catastrophe. And within 2 years, you've got like acres and acres. You can scale it up so rapidly.
Yeah, which is something I never really respected about them. Permaculture people often look at annuals in a very disdainful kind of way, but like
Mm.
looking at it now, it's like, wow, yeah, if you have half of your orchard wiped out from a natural disaster, it's going to take you 15 years, potentially to get it back in production. With an annual crop, you might have a bad year here and there, but you also have a lot more flexibility.
Mm. But I mean, ultimately, it's about integrating all of these elements, like the
Yes.
livestock, the trees, and the annuals all have a really important role to play. And I guess that
Yeah.
makes it even more challenging for just like lone weirdos like you and me trying to solve this problem in on our own relatively in isolation.
Yeah. Well, you've probably heard the term, whole farm planning. So, really um, designing your farm around a holistic system, really that incorporates your own needs as a human being, but also looks at these different timescales in terms of production, in terms of what the land can produce, and also just the variabilities in terms of the landscape itself. Like we have huge constraints um, for us on certain types of inputs just because of elevation change and
Mm,
gravity.
mm.
like mulching for us is a, if you're in a mountainous landscape, mulching, the physics of mulching, the human and at times mechanical effort of mulching
Mm,
is really not something you can ignore.
mm.
It's all things, all these different things. Every farmscape, every homestead is different, and you really have to look at these local conditions.
I'm reminded of something too, like the timescales of solutions. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but Northern Florida used to have a huge citrus industry that like sprang up
Mhm.
overnight after World War II. And I think it was sometime in the 70s or 80s, they got like a once in 50-year frost and it just froze all of the trees and killed them. And the industry didn't come back because now they had that data point saying, yeah, it's not worth doing this in the long run.
Yeah, stuff like that can happen, and people will try to find really weird solutions to some of that stuff. I know in Florida they had these little lanterns, or they weren't candles exactly, but they had ways of actually heating their orchards uh, to prevent that from happening.
Hmm.
Um, but it's like it's very costly and very kind of uncertain. Um, and I sort of get that sometimes thinking about pollination issues in my orchard. Like my father is an arborist and kind of a landscape person, and he says, "Well, why don't you have you ever thought about kind of like mechanically pollinating your trees?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but Dad, think about doing that at scale. Like it's
Yeah.
just like there will be people if the product is valuable enough, it's justifiable. Um, but yeah, sometimes like fighting against nature in that way is just not a winnable battle.
Do you know of anyone doing controlled hand pollination with hazels? If like there's a
Yes,
particular combo, have you ever done it?
I've not done it, but they do that for breeding purposes. So if
Mm.
you want to do controlled crosses, and we thought about doing that where you set up almost like a little tent
Hmm.
to keep exogenous pollen sources out, and then you hand pollinate. If you want to do controlled crossbreeding, that is the way to do it.
Mm.
We've let other people do that for us in terms of breeding programs, but it's something we've thought about down the road if we ever wanted to take some of our more successful varieties and maybe try to hybridize them a little bit.
Yeah, marry them up.
It is something you can do.
Arranged marriage.
Yeah. Well, hazels, I mean, just like apples, are very heterozygous, so they don't come true from seed.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, if you are willing to select, there's been this whole debate in the hazelnut world of, is it better to do clones, the European varieties versus, Mark Shepard and some of the people out in the Midwest who are going through these more rapid breeding cycles using stuff from seed,
Yeah,
where
mass selection.
they
Yeah.
they ignore the heterozygosity and they go, they just say, oh, well, we'll just burn through it a few generations and we'll come up with improved varieties that way. And
Mm,
I was initially very skeptical of that approach, but after seeing some improved American hazelnut varieties, especially further up north where they can deal with the cold a little bit better,
mhm.
I'm sort of thinking, yeah, maybe it's probably too late for me to switch, but there's something to be said for that approach.
It's a time and numbers game and attention
Yes,
too. You need those
yes,
three ingredients to make progress. We should probably shift on to talking a bit about towards the last third of an interview. I normally talk about how people connect with other breeders and social networks and all that kind of stuff. But you've got a much more interesting topic, which we've teased in the opening. So tell us about that kind of journey that's led you into these like deeper cultural worldview issues about like how we
yeah.
approach all of these problems.
Well, I'll sort of tell you a little story about how it started.
Hmm.
I think I mentioned that I was interested in archaeology, so it's just kind of just a little hobby, topic that I read about. And I was reading about these pots that ancient Neolithic European people. This was after agriculture spread into Europe for the first time, but before we get any like anything we would call civilization in Europe. So they were small iron, like early, not Iron Age. I would say they were like probably like early Bronze Age, late Stone Age, farming communities. They would make these pots, right? And they would use the pots to store the seeds for for the next year's planting cycle. So, and they would store them usually underground, and they would. This was after pottery first came about in Europe, so they used the pots to protect them against mice and other things that would want to eat um, their seed crops. But one of the things that the archaeologists were really noticing about these pots is that they had certain features on them decoratively that seemed to be related to how those people thought about the soil. The pots were made to look like the soil that they lived in, and there were
Mm.
certain symbols and decorations on the pots that really kind of brought up imagery of maybe furrows and different sort of things that you would see in farming. So, and there was a whole, the people who were writing about this archaeological site were using this as an example of what they called, I think they called it visual interreferencing. So it's this idea that if you've ever heard of sympathetic magic, where there's an idea that like if something is shaped like something else or something looks like something else, it has a sort of almost metaphysical connection to that thing.
Hmm.
This was sort of like where alchemy came from in Renaissance Europe. If you take that sort of idea and like go really far back with it, visual interreferencing is sort of like a similar principle. And you can see this in other archaeological motifs as well, where like early, if like the people who sort of settled Europe or invaded Europe, depending on how you look at it, they would make their pots look like they had woven, almost like they were made out of a woven material, because they were nomads and they initially used baskets more than pots.
Mm.
And so if you want something to look sort of strong, like it's going to hold up in a wagon, you kind of make it look like it's a basket in a way to sort of, and there were things that they were doing where, maybe some of the things they were doing were improving the structural integrity of the pots, but it was more of this kind of intuitive sort of, we're going to make it look like this other thing.
Is that
And
almost like a skewer morph? You know about skewer morphs?
no,
So on your mobile phone, there'll be an icon for a phone, but it's an old rotary phone handset.
oh,
So it's the way that when technology changes, the symbols for things, the representation for things kind of lags behind. And that sounds like a Bronze Age, Stone Age example of that.
yeah, almost. Yeah.
Mm.
Because it's like we have this visual symbolic system that we're sort of tuned to that has a life of its own.
Mm.
But it's all sort of interconnected in this way that we don't really appreciate now. So
Mm.
the whole point about these pots is that I realized when I was looking at, these studies that they were doing that I don't think this way. I don't look at objects in my environment in this way. And
Mm.
that they had a whole visual vocabulary that was tied into their whole system of survival. And the more that I dug into that mentality, the more I realized that the way they dealt with the seasons, the lunar cycles, different plants and animals with each other, social hierarchy, like there's all sorts of different categories that they sort of viewed in this sort of more symbolic, cyclical way of sort of weaving themselves into the pattern of the cosmos as they understood it.
Mhm.
And I come at things from a pretty my default way of looking at things is from a very kind of rational and sort of scientific modern point of view. So to look at this stuff, it was sort of a really a kind of humbling moment in terms of like being like, wow, I really don't have the capability of appreciating and interacting with my world in quite this way.
Mm.
And so, like a good reductionist or scientist or materialist or whatever you want to call it, I started thinking, okay, how could I get there? So, um, how could I actually have the experiential, um,
How to change your mind.
yes, how to change your mind, as the Michael Pollan book, very adeptly points out. So, yeah, I'm not the only one discovering this. Um, so that's what sort of got me into, what are the actual sort of almost physical practices behind shamanism. Shamanism is sort of a contentious, topic term for a lot of different reasons, but you know, basically looking at the way that prehistoric populations most likely um, altered their states of consciousness in a way that made them um, more susceptible to insights, spontaneous insights, implicit learning, and other things that made them a little more adaptable um, in a time when relying on controlled scientific studies was not really an option.
Mm. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question about like how cultures change. I mean, it's kind of a level beyond a paradigm shift, isn't it? It's like a whole worldview shift. And in some ways, we've gone through something a bit like that with the digital age exploding onto the scene. But I'm really interested too to think ahead, like if we ever lost our digital technology, how would culture adapt to having like much slower flows, much more regionalized kind of access to information? That's something I'm really interested in as well. Whether if we would return to a more shamanistic, animistic form if we didn't have like even a printing press anymore.
Yeah, I think there's good reasons to think that we would. The guy who did the book on basically, it was a recent book that had to do with genetics, but also has to do with kind of European history. Um, I want to get his name right. I feel like this is the third big name that I sort of should remember in this thing. Um,
It's more important to
anyways,
remember the ideas than the author.
the idea basically is that the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, all these different things put these selection pressures on European populations that made them kind of weird when it comes to family structure and education and other things like that.
Basically
Um,
breaking up the clan structure because they banned cousin
yes,
marriage, which apparently there'd already been a history of that up to that point, but the early Catholic Church basically cemented it and
yes,
turbocharged that trend.
to the point where it would actually, have an effect on a whole, continent-wide, population.
Mm,
But he also points out that there are pretty rapid, changes that you can see in other cultures. One of the examples he gives is um, when I think it was cassava was first introduced to Africa.
mm,
There's something in the processing of it that takes out cyanide,
mm.
um, which is sort of a natural byproduct of the plant. And where it was indigenous, people had worked out these cultural methods of doing that, but where it was introduced, they had no idea, and people were getting sick, people were getting goiters, thyroid problems. Um, but eventually, people learned, like, simply not as a part of really a scientific process, but just looking at, okay, this family over here is very successful, and this is how they cook this this is how they cook that crop.
Hmm.
We're going to copy them. So I think humans have kind of this built-in ability to learn from each other's successes. Um, and I think, you could probably make the case that cultures, that had shamanistic practices were probably at an advantage, especially in hunting, um, over others that did not. And they were probably like, can we borrow your shaman? Shamans were often, these sort of liminal figures that would travel between different communities, um, and would teach other people about how they did things. And it was probably a huge advantage. So I think there probably is some potential for that, depending on you know how
Now,
badly our systems degrade.
this is the really fun intersection that I hope I'm heading in the right in the same direction as you. Could How could we preserve a culture of plant and livestock breeding into the future? And could a specialized role like a shaman that goes from village to village saying, "Oh, you're growing these things. I've brought you these seeds from like, 1,000 kilometers away. Try growing them, and here's how you breed them and select them." Do you think that could be like a future vital cultural tool in like as we leave the industrial age?
Yes, I mean we've definitely seen that before. In again, going back to Neolithic Europe, like metallurgy, when it was first sort of introduced, when it first started spreading, that was essentially considered a form of magic. And
Hmm.
the people who were um, going around to different communities, sort of doing itinerant metalworking, were considered people of special knowledge and power, and they sort of used that prestige to give them the kind of hospitality and access to resources they needed that made it safe to travel between different communities. We see the same thing with pottery. There's really great archaeological evidence in Europe of potters being travelers, people who had special skills, special knowledge, who, because the value became of what they did became sort of culturally ingrained, had this sort of mystique to it. They were welcomed into communities that would otherwise treat them as foreigners, as being like, hey, look, these people, we're bringing them in. They're going to make some pots for us. They're going to show us how to do certain things. So could we have a
Do you know
similar?
with England after Rome left, they'd gotten so dependent on importing mass-produced pottery from the European continent that their local pottery traditions died out. They couldn't take the competition. It's just like globalism today. But when the Romans left, the people in Britain like struggled to make basic pottery for like 100 years until they eventually imported a French family into England to like show us how to do it properly again.
Yeah, that's sort of like the other side of it is like once you lose a certain amount of knowledge,
Mm.
how long and what resources do you have to expend to get it back?
Hmm. Hmm.
It can be pretty devastating
Well,
depending
with
on what the
biological
resource is.
resources, you're looking at potentially millions, tens of millions of years if you wanted to recreate like a whole family or a whole genus.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if certain heirloom crops, if they get lost, or if the knowledge of how to reproduce, how to propagate them is lost, it's may never come back, depending on
Mm.
what it is.
Have you heard of John Michael Greer's concept of green wizards? I think he started a community around the idea of these kind of sustainable technologies ending up in like expert hands who kind of preserve a living tradition of those skills and resources.
A little bit because and he's an interesting figure. Because you mentioned him before, and I was like, it didn't register immediately. But it's like, oh yeah, he is
A druid.
into he well, yeah, exactly. He's a collapsed person, but he's also a druid. I'm not familiar with that particular part of his work. Um, but yeah, he's somebody sort of like thinking the long game in terms of like how do we what previous sort of systems of if you're a Western anthropologist, a modern anthropologist looking at um, at other cultures, you would call it a indigenous wisdom system or an indigenous knowledge system. Like, but one of the things that modern culture is bad at is recognizing that like we're a culture too, and like what are our knowledge systems that might be vulnerable to failure, and if they are, how do we what backup cultural practices do we have to preserve them?
What do we drag out of the burning building to dump on the lawn while there's still time?
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah. I don't know because, like, again, this sort of going back to this question of what can we learn from these other ways of thinking and interacting with the world. Um, it's a different mindset as much as it is a different thing that you know. So if you ask the question like, well, what do you what's the biggest thing you learned from learning to ride a bicycle? it's kind of a trick question because it's not like being able to say what you learned from riding a bicycle isn't really the point. It's the ability to ride a bike.
Mm,
Swimming, it's like it's not a fact that you're drawing from swimming, the ability to swim. It's not telling you something new about the world that you can say as a swimmer that you can't say as somebody who can't swim. It's the ability to swim.
mm,
So we have these different ways of looking at the interconnectedness of the world. Ecology in a scientific sense, as a scientific discipline, certainly understands the interconnectedness of the world in a very discursive analytic framework. Um, but that framework is dependent upon knowledge producers and knowledge keepers uh, in a very, very intensive way that we might not be able to replicate in a social organization that doesn't have access to international communities of higher learning, for example.
mm.
Um, in which case, it's not necessarily that one community knows something that the other doesn't. It's that one can use implicit learning and other kind of fuzzier ways of doing things to come at similar conclusions that might not be as well defended or well articulated as we would like in a scientific context, but still produce similar results in terms of human flourishing and productivity and things like that.
Now, you've probably heard me bang on about monasteries in the past. That I
A
think
little bit, yeah.
they're a really interesting example of a replicatable model that generated these like amazing network effects, and it did it during like a really difficult time in history. And I wonder if something like this shamanism, animism leaning kind of green wizard post-tech wandering plant breeding guru uh, person could find the greatest impact in something like a new monastic movement.
Right. And what would a community like that look like?
Well, I think the monastery would, rather than, just chanting and praying to God and like trying to save everyone's soul, it would be a place in the community where if you had someone wandering in from another town who had this expertise and resources that they brought over a long distance, that would be the place they would naturally be able to establish and do some good for the community. It's almost like the old what were they called? The land grant universities used to do a lot of
hmm,
agricultural
yeah.
research in all the different little bioregions of the US until they all got kind of swept up in just becoming degree mills or shut down. But yeah, that on a smaller, more localized scale, that any place that's, fertile enough to support, a kind of a regional kind of village scale dispersed population would make a place for a little monastery to do breeding and trials and have a place for people to come in from other institutions to share genetics and skills.
And I think you definitely see some of that in cultures where actually Appalachia is a good example of this, where um, our geographical and economic isolation from the rest of the world kind of required people here to come up with certain things um, on their own. So there's a whole, tradition out here. It's mostly died out, but there's still a little bit of it left of basically folk medicine, like folk healers,
Hmm. Hmm.
medicine people who were very syncretic and they had some ideas that they brought with them from Europe. Some of their ideas came from escaped slaves that they interacted with and who were finding refuge in the mountains. Other times it was indigenous people, Cherokee, especially where
Hmm.
I am, who were in the landscape and were able to pass on some of their knowledge. But these were people who, because there was not really great access to medicine or modern institutions, they people who had a skill for it specialized, and people where those resources are not available would call upon them for help. So if you think about something like that, maybe scaling up in a situation where our other institutions have failed, um, you could definitely see it becoming, something specialized to the point where, maybe there is a dedicated place for it or a dedicated organization of people who, might be doing some of these things in a really dedicated focused setting like a monastery or almost like a research outpost. Because it kind of we're kind of talking about these weird hybrids of um, yeah, like the scientific world, but also, other ways of sort of interacting with nature.
Has
Yeah,
shamanism been syncretized into other religions? I'm
oh yeah.
thinking like Shinto would probably be a good example. It's a semi-formalized shamanism.
I would say so. So Shinto, I'm not an expert in it, but it is really good at preserving some of the more animistic aspects of um, sort of the belief system, which is really interesting because you don't really see that too much in other places where they've been able to go through this process of state formation and modernization while preserving kind of an animistic um, cosmology. Now, I'm not
Mm,
sure if Shinto actually includes too many like shamanic practices in the sense of ritual or ecstatic states that allow for alterations of consciousness and sort of insight generation in that way.
mm,
They might. So I'm pleading ignorance on that one. But Catholicism would be another big example. So in Latin America, especially, there's been a huge synchronization of shamanistic practices that have sort of carried over um, into Catholicism, whether
mm.
it's the saints or sort of um, kind of because they had to make it work with the colonial pressures they were under, to be like, well, how do we preserve the knowledge we have? How do we use what we know how to do in a way where the official authorities aren't um, you know persecuting us as
Yeah.
quite as much as they might. So
And
it's sort of this.
if you look to the very origin and spread of Christianity, they've been doing that since day one. Like it's not a
Yes,
new thing.
yeah. Well, I'm one of my other I'm partially of Welsh descent, so I have a big interest in like British the history of well, the Druids and Celtic cultures and how they integrated with Christianity, and yeah, this story of how this new religion comes in where there was an older knowledge system that was persecuted, but it also preserved elements of its stories and mythology in different ways, especially when it comes to knowledge of the landscape. So, in Britain, there's all these, sacred sites that have long histories going way back. There's even theories that, if you look at Welsh mythology, there's stories about the sea level being a different level.
Hmm.
And, I've always wondered, like, well, now there's it's kind of a longer story, but like, is this preserving? Like, how far back does the knowledge go in terms of how it's preserved in the mythology? It's really hard to establish it firmly, but it really does make you think about yeah, how much when there are these pivotal cultural changes where one way of being human or one way of living in the world is lost, and another one is sort of takes over. Is it really lost? Like how like are do parts of it remain, and if so, how far back do they go?
Hmm.
In Siberia, there are living folk memories of um, woolly mammoths. There's one community in Siberia that has preserved um, in their shamanistic practices. They have preserved knowledge of woolly mammoths, which you're talking about an indigenous knowledge system that where that element at least probably goes back 12,000 years. My understanding is that in Australia, there's evidence of things that go back even further. So
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, the resilience of these cultural systems
It,
can be really incredible.
it's sad when you think that's the way we're going. That's probably going to be the case for rhinoceros. Like thousands of years from now, they'll be like, "Oh wow, you could actually go somewhere and see a live rhinoceros." But yeah,
Yeah,
they're just a distant memory.
I've seen YouTube videos of titled things like, "Well, what extinct animals did the Romans see?" You
Hmm.
know, someday people are going to be you know telling those stories about us.
Mm.
Sadly,
Yeah, well, it's my big thing that I keep pushing anytime anyone's listening that I reckon we've got a window to domesticate elephants because there used to be so many more species. You were talking about mammoths, and we've got kind of two main. separate lineages, the African and the Asian ones left, and they do hybridize. And hybridizing things is normally how you get them to domesticate and actually start breeding with humans. Because we can tame wild elephants, but we haven't figured out how to make them want to produce more elephants close to us.
Right.
And I think it's doable. I think it's within reach.
And it seems to be like like, because we kind of domesticated ourselves too, right?
Hmm.
So this process of domestication, especially if you look at like wolves and dogs, like where it is something that we are quote unquote doing, but it's also kind of like a natural way that these species might fit into each other.
Hmm.
Um, to, and we've seen it replicated with plants, with all sorts of different species. Like if I think about, is there a good human story about how humans can live on the earth sort of sustainably? Like I think that process of domestication is sort of a part of it, where
Mm.
it's sort of like almost this magical thing that happens where, and just to go back to shamanism a little bit, like a lot of what shamanism is realizing, understanding the world through the eyes of beings that are not human.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it's that radical empathy that goes
yes,
beyond
exactly.
anything that should be possible.
Yeah, which, when I would have to think that the domestication of the horse probably involved like, okay, somebody thinking really hard. I shouldn't say thinking, I should say somebody feeling really hard. What is it like to be a horse?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, if we had a little more time to do that with some of our animal allies on Earth, our future might be a little bit brighter for us and for them.
Tying it back to tree crops and
Yeah,
your own observations that trees can become their own worst enemy if they're just kind of left to do their thing. What do
yeah.
you think of my theory that Um, the animals we domesticated were grassland animals, so it made a form of agriculture that replicates grasslands. But for tree crops, we need forest uh, compatible animals. And elephants, I think, are the last megafauna out there that can like push a tree over without all
Hmm.
sorts of fancy equipment and tools. And that they could be the missing ingredient for making tree-based agriculture scalable and successful.
I think it's a really interesting idea because you do hear that, and about I was taking a workshop last year. It was like a primitive skills thing, and my teacher lives in the woods, and he's like, we really want to be on open ground. Like if you really think about like being a human, like you need to be able to see, you need access to certain materials, you need to be able to locate those materials. Like it really makes sense. Like forests are not it um, for a human being. And I'm thinking, well, that might be true for the skills that we've developed, and like you're saying, the species we've domesticated.
Mm-hmm.
But does it have to be that way? So
Mm-hmm.
thinking about what that would look like um, in a system with more trees, which does have other advantages, especially in a temperate. I'm speaking from a temperate perspective where um, heating is a huge issue.
Mm-hmm.
So having sustainable sources of fuel wood, if you're having to prune things regularly and producing these artificial light gaps, yeah, what are the ideal forest species? And then I look at, we have white-tailed deer are biggest herbivore sort of in this part of the world. Um, and they really are, they're kind of an edge species. They move between forests and open ground, but
Mm-hmm.
um, they're remarkably well adapted to forests. And it's sort of like, okay, I have these sheep, but what would something closer to um, a deer that is a little more nimble in a forest and has a little more adaptability there, what would that look like if it were sort of more domesticated? And it's a little hard to see sometimes, but yeah, these are the sort of questions like what does the land that you're on want to produce? What is the most sort of harmonious exponent of that landscape look like?
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, that's a great point to transition to one of my favorite questions. If you could like magically transform a crop or an animal into whatever you wanted, like it's, as long as it's plausible in the end, what would you like wish into the world?
I mean, how radical are we thinking here?
Oh, if it takes, thousands of years and billions of dollars, then it's still on the table.
I mean, if you could produce a tree that would, you know, shed like chicken nuggets or something, like basically like I want protein from trees. That's kind of like, um, yeah, that would be my dream is some sort of, and the hazelnut is gets a little bit close to that. It's a little more fat than protein,
Hmm.
but yeah, a high protein, like getting like for, like being human, like having this sort of um, without getting into a whole thing about, I know, the paleo diet was like really big like 10 years ago
Hmm.
or whatever. You know, obviously we can survive on lots of different food sources, but like um but it seems pretty clear that having a sufficiency of protein is really important for human health, but it's so bad for human populations at any kind of scale. And it's
Hmm.
bad for the animals that have to, experience life sometimes in ways that are not optimized for their well-being. So,
Hmm.
how can you if yeah, so a tree that sheds chicken nuggets is going to be my answer on that
That's the most American answer I've ever heard. I love
one.
it. I love it.
Thank you.
Maybe you can breed those marmorated stink bugs to smell like chicken nuggets instead.
They do smell like my wife makes fun of me whenever I say this, but I think they smell like melons.
Ah.
Like I don't find the smell of them like, and I want to look into the chemistry of this because there is something about that stink bug smell. Smells like cucumber and melon to me. And,
Hmm.
maybe it could be a exotic ingredient for a cocktail someday.
Or a fancy cologne.
There you go.
Stink, but instead of a K, it's Quue.
Oh yeah, French it up. Make it
I'd love
classy.
it.
Yes.
And final question I'd like to wrap on.
Yeah.
What is your vision for the future of food in your community?
Well, I mean, I would love to say that we are, Appalachia, 70 years from now will be, the hazelnut center of, North America. And it could still happen, but yeah, I think growing really, really high value crops with very, very low inputs on very rough land is possible. And if it allows a traditionally isolated and economically, usually disenfranchised part of the world to become more, not just more sustainable, but more affluent, I think that would be a beautiful example for other places.
I love it. I love it. I can see it. I've got it. I wish I could visit that part of the world. It sings to me, but it may or may not happen. So I get the impression you're a fairly private person. So this
Yep.
is normally the part where I say if people want to follow up on any of your work or get in touch. But if you want to remain private, that's up to you too. Do you have any thoughts on that?
They can talk to you and
Hmm. I'll vet them
yeah, no,
if they're not just trying to sell you a condo in in Florida.
no,
Um,
I don't have a website. I don't have a podcast. I don't have any books. I don't have anything. So, and I
mm.
do want to keep it that way.
And I really
But I
appreciate that people in your position are still willing to talk to me about things that you're doing.
Oh, well, the feeling is mutual. I love that people are thinking about this and reaching out and learning from each other. And it's one of the few good things that have really come out of this internet culture is resources like your Substack and your YouTube and all that stuff. It's what it should be for.
Mm, exactly. Yeah, we've got the tools. We just need to use them in a way that is productive and helpful.
Well said. Well said.
Mm. Okay, well, Capello, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
The Zero Input Agriculture podcast is a solo passion project built with my ample time and meagre resources. If you would like to support the show, then sign up for a paid subscription to my Zero Input Agriculture blog at Substack. As a reward, you can read all my past posts and listen to the audiobook of Taming the Apocalypse. If you prefer reading about the past and future of biological technology, you can read the ebook of Taming the Apocalypse through Amazon. And finally, please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you use, since it helps other people find me. Or recommend the show directly to anyone who could use some inspiration to become a plant breeder themselves.